Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion on the significance of spectrum management and safeguarding our national security and fostering robust economic strategy. In the interconnected world where wireless technologies serve as the lifeblood of our daily existence and the backbone of the nation's economy, mobile's presence is skyrocketing in the upcoming decades. Beneath the surface of these transformative technologies lies an imperceptible realm of immense importance, the spectrum or the invisible radio waves on which all wireless devices rely. As our voracious appetite for cutting-edge wireless services continues to surge, the spectrum environment has become increasingly contested and constrained. Concurrently, policy disputes among the diverse array of stakeholders, from established license holders, the emerging unlicensed innovators, as well as government agencies, have grown intense as the spectrum usage reaches an unprecedented level. Regrettably, the United States currently lacks a comprehensive plan to effectively accommodate the nation's future spectrum requirements. Recognizing this pressing need, our foremost policies need to acknowledge the urgency of our national spectrum strategy that needs to be addressed in the challenge head-on by actually having a national spectrum strategy. Highlighting the importance of spectrum management in today's discussion, we are going to underscore the reliance on wireless technology is not merely a matter of convenience. It is inseparable from our national security and serves as the cornerstone to our economic prosperity. To safeguard our interests and unlock the full potential of the wireless connectivity, it is imperative that we develop a strategic framework that holistically addresses our national spectrum needs. In the face of escalating demands and amplification of conflict, we need a national spectrum strategy that secures our wireless future. So here are my guests today. I'm very excited to have you all here. Thank you for being here. We're going to start with Clete Johnson. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Clete is a non-resident senior fellow over there for the technology program. In addition to CSIS, Clete is affiliated with the partners of Wilkinson Barker Nauer. Mr. Johnson was most recently a senior advisor for cybersecurity and technology at the U.S. Department of Commerce, where he coordinated the department's cybersecurity initiatives and support for the Commission's enhancing national security. He also has been a department representative for National Security Council staff deliberations on cybersecurity, encryption, and other policies in the intersection of technology and security. Previously, Clete was appointed at the Federal Communications Commission as the first chief counsel for cybersecurity. Before this time, he was with Senator Rockefeller as the designated counsel on Senate Intelligence and Council for Defense, Foreign Policy, and International Trade. Earlier in his life, he served in the U.S. Army in Germany, Korea, and the Balkans. Peter Rysavy is the president of Rysavy Research, a consulting firm that has specialized in computer networking and wireless technology since 1993. His projects include computer network architecture assessments, analysis of spectrum requirements for mobile broadband, reports on the evolution of wireless technology, evaluation of wireless technology capabilities, system design, network performance measurements, and acting as an expert in patent litigation cases. Peter is broadly published in the expert capacities and evolution of computer networks. Everything I know about 5G, I learned initially from Peter. He had to do this. He had to probably go through that deck twice with me multiple times. He's also performs technical evaluations for many wireless technology companies, including cellular data services, mesh Wi-Fi. So anything you want to know about Wi-Fi later, Peter's your guy. He can explain why it does or doesn't work. From 2000 to 2016, and the answer is just turn it off and turn it on. From 2000 to 2016, Peter was the executive director of the Wireless Technology Association, an industry organization that evaluates wireless technologies, investigates mobile communication architectures, and promotes wireless data interoperability. Paroma Sanyal is with the principal at the Brattle group. They have a study that has come out, which we will put a link to. And also, Clete has a paper that we'll put a link to this morning. Dr. Sanyal is a telecommunications industry expert specializing in spectrum policy, auction authority, broadband competition, regulation, consumer protection, and intellectual property matters. Before joining Brattle, she was the chief economist at the Federal Communications Commission. And before she joined the FCC, she was an assistant professor at Brandeis University, where she held joint positions in the economic department in the International Business Bureau. She frequently advises the FCC on regulatory issues in fixed and mobile broadband, spectrum auctions, spectrum value, spectrum availability, and she consults on numerous major FCC spectrum subsidy auctions and helps clients navigate the complexity of regulatory issues. My last guest here is Joel Thayer. He is currently the president of the Digital Progress Institute. Before DPI, he practiced law as an associate at Phillips Lytle. Prior to that, he served as the policy counsel for ACT, the App Association, where he advises on legal policy issues related to antitrust, telecommunications, privacy, cybersecurity, and intellectual property. Joel has worked as a legal clerk for the FCC Chairman Ajit Pai and FTC Commissioner Maureen Olhausen. Additionally, he spent time on Capitol Hill working for Congressman Lee Terry from the great state of Nebraska. And he worked for Congressman Mary Bono, who represents his home state of California.
Go Huskies.
Yeah, thanks. Joel's really great when he has to explain something to me. He explained something to me yesterday. He's like, it's like football, Shane. I'll give it to you in yardage. I was like, I get that. I'm from Nebraska. So thank you all for being here for this really important discussion. And it's one of these things when this issue kind of came top of mind, I just had no idea that anyone would think to not reauthorize our spectrum auction authority. So that is going to be a key thing that we're going to talk about today, as well as the need for a spectrum pipeline. So we're looking forward to you guys explaining a lot of this, but first let's just do a little table setting because I realize we have a lot of experts in the room, but a few of you, this might be a new thing. So to use a phrase that someone in this panel gave to me, it's not politics, it's physics. So we're going to start with Peter, who really knows about the physics of this all. Can you start by sharing your insights and what makes 5G and eventually 6G such a big deal for the U.S. to get right?
5G is truly revolutionary in its capabilities that consumers are only now beginning to appreciate because everything that they do simply works better than 4G. But the reason it does that is that 5G is extremely flexible in the spectrum it uses. That's one of its capabilities, meaning that it can harness the spectrum used by cellular networks traditionally in the past, such as below 2 gigahertz, but it can also operate in mid-band frequencies through, well, the definition of mid-band keeps changing, but let's say 6 to 10 gigahertz, and it can also operate in millimeter wave. The result of that is that 5G offers extremely high capacity, can be deployed very densely, and as a consequence, it can compete against wireline solutions such as cable broadband. In addition to its spectrum flexibility, it also has very granular quality of service, and that means that with 5G, you can control and offer users different throughput rates, different reliability rates. For example, some applications may need to be extremely reliable, such as, say, drone control or controlling robots inside a factory. It has positioning capabilities where you can locate devices to, say, like within 10 centimeters, so that if you wanted automated devices inside a warehouse, then you would have that precision. It also has very low latency, so that a lot of applications that are very latency sensitive, such as virtual reality, augmented reality, also industrial control applications. So the bottom line there is that 5G can address a wide range of use cases that aren't necessarily consumer-oriented, but they're very much business and enterprise-oriented. What really 5G does is provide an infrastructure for a lot of economic activity that was not previously possible with 4G. So that's it in a nutshell.
So this is also a global issue. So explain why the need for us to be thinking about 5G from a global perspective, and then what is the challenge that we're seeing with China, who does have a spectrum pipeline where we do not?
Yeah, so China at this point has allocated far more spectrum for 5G in the mid-band frequencies. As I mentioned, 5G operates in a lot of different frequencies, but it's mid-band, say 2 to 6 gigahertz right now, especially around 3 or 4 gigahertz, that 5G provides the optimal blend of coverage and performance, which means you can offer very high throughput rates into hundreds of megabits per second, but you can also economically deploy that capability over large coverage areas. This is really where 5G shines, and it's the area where a lot of innovation is going to take place. A lot of new applications, again, enterprise, automated vehicles, and China recognizes the value of this and how this kind of broadband foundation is going to enable a lot of industrial and commercial activity, and at this point has allocated something like 3 times as much spectrum in the mid-band areas as the US has. So this really, I see, puts us at a strategic disadvantage in having the broadband foundation to support a lot of other industries.
Great, thanks. Paroma, to bring you into this conversation, I know you just did a report that had some projections. So talk about what you learned in your most recent report that's important to this discussion.
Yes, I think taking off from where Peter left off, the 5G and mid-band is kind of the Goldilocks of spectrum. And when we began our report, it was more with a view towards, okay, we don't have a pipeline, we don't have spectrum authority currently. Where do we see ourselves in the next 5 to 10 years? Can we innovate ourselves out of the situation? And just to give you a spoiler, the answer is no. We do need that exclusively licensed spectrum. We need, of course, we need some shared, and we can talk about that later, but what our paper focused on was exclusive spectrum and the importance of it. And we actually looked at sort of 4 different strategies pretty carefully, and we looked at demand reduction strategies. Can the US do enough? You know, you hear of Wi-Fi offload. So can the US do enough of a Wi-Fi offload on unlicensed so that the demand that we see now, which is like, you know, growing 5 to 10 times, can you do something there? You can do something at the margin, but that is definitely not a solution for not having more spectrum. The second thing we looked at, actually the next 3 things we looked at, more technology-based. And this is something Peter is very familiar with. The first is spectral efficiency. Whenever now you hear people talking about spectral efficiency and how efficiently you can use spectrum, you'll hear numbers thrown like, oh, 5 and 6G have, you know, spectral efficiencies that are 10, 20, 30 times better than what you saw in 3G, 4G. That is not exactly the right scenario to look at. Those might be done in laboratory settings, but whenever you talk to engineers, what they will tell you at the maximum, if say maybe, you know, 4G was 2.5 bits per second per hertz, 6G maybe 6. So that's definitely not your, you know, that many-fold increase. And when you factor that in, what you realize very soon is no amount of spectral efficiency is really going to get you out of not having more spectrum. There's another trade-off, right? You can have spectrum or you can have more cell towers. So we looked at both the growth of macro cell towers and the growth of small cells. And even with a very aggressive growth projection, that is not something that gets you all the way there. So what we found in our paper was in the near term, in about 5 years, we will have a spectrum deficit of about like 400, 430 megahertz. And this is, when I talk about the deficit, this is exclusive licensed mid-band spectrum. And in about 10, if we don't do anything, that grows to about 1,500 megahertz. And this is the base projection. If you think demand is going to grow even by 10%, this becomes a larger deficit. So there is definitely a need now to get more mid-band spectrum into the pipeline.
So you mentioned sharing, and as someone who grew up with sisters, and the theory of sharing in a closet just absolutely do not work. It's a great idea in theory. So is it possible to share? Explain how you share a spectrum band.
Sure. So as an economist, I come at it from a trade-off perspective. It's all about costs and benefits. So if the cost of share, suppose the cost of clearing a spectrum band is extremely high, then there is a possibility that by sharing, you can bring that spectrum much faster into the market. However, if there's a spectrum band that you can clear for very low cost, as you know, the FCC auction has to raise 110% of the relocation cost. So that becomes sort of your gating factor of what the relocation cost is. And that's why sort of the sharing and exclusivity for me is on a spectrum, and it's completely dependent on the trade-off between where the relocation costs lie and sort of where the benefits are. And one thing that's worth mentioning is a lot of the fights are, I think, in the relocation cost arena what does it really cost to move certain incumbent operations from a spectrum band? And that is, I think, an area where a lot more needs to be done.
Thanks. So Clete, you have a new paper out, actually you have a series of paper, and your second one is out this week. So tell us what you're writing about in this topic.
Well, as distinct from Paroma and Peter, I am not an economist or a spectrum engineer. I'm a national security policy lawyer. And what we're looking at in this series of papers are both the big picture strategic security considerations that Peter mentioned about competition with China, but even more pointedly, and I'll put a finer point on it, the hard security, the tangible security implications of the U.S. and its market democratic allies falling behind China in mid-band spectrum allocation, specifically licensed. That's where we're behind. And I want to be clear, this is not about the Chinese people or China as a society. It's about the Chinese government, which is the Chinese Communist Party, which is probably the most, I'd say, inarguably the most powerful authoritarian state in world history. And the issue here is data in the 21st century. What 5G will do, as most people probably know, and Peter explained, 5G is not just about cell phones. It's about connected devices and sensors that will encompass just about every element of human, and in some cases, the flora and fauna life as well. Basically, everything that happens in the world, maybe except for going for a long hike in the woods without your phone, will kick up digital dust and data that will create more digital data collected and able to be analyzed in orders of magnitude more than has ever existed in history. The reason that matters is that what that means to us in the free market democratic world is more expression, more innovation, more human freedom, more ability to solve the world's, the challenges of health, climate, et cetera. What that means for an authoritarian state is a police state, social control, algorithmic understanding of what every one of us do, where we go, in some cases, what we think. And so what we're looking at through this paper series, which began with a big picture look at that question of 5G's importance to market democracy. I really believe that this is an existential issue for the United States, because the United States was the world's first market democracy. And we now lead an alliance, multiple alliances of defense treaty allies, NATO, Japan, Korea, and Australia, others, that are not just military alliances, they're alliances of market democracies. And the threat to market democracies now is no longer communism as communism, it's authoritarianism as powered by 21st century data, AI, cyber operations, information operations. So that's why, to me, it's a screaming need. If the United States is behind China on spectrum allocation, and I'll wrap this up, we can get more into why spectrum is crucial to this. It's the invisible natural resource that enables 5G. So if we are behind on the commercial use of that spectrum, we are going to be behind autocracy in technology in the 21st century. And I think that's an existential issue. It has actually it's not intangible, it's not the economy versus security. It is, if China dominates 21st century technology, they also dominate 21st century cyber operations, information operations, force projection, and ultimately weapon systems. So we cannot fall behind on this. And again, I think if we don't lead in 5G, China will, and then they will dominate 21st century.
So thanks, that's a great no, again, for table, there's just all the stakes that are on the table here. And so, while I did say it's not political, it's physics, Joel, we're going to come to you because it does seem to be a bit political these days. Explain what Spectrum Auction Authority is and why is it hung up?
Sure. I think before that, just to round it all up, comments that Clete is making harkens back to a short emperor who had a similar thought about China, which was Napoleon, who said, "Well, let China sleep. When it wakes, she will shaketh the world, and I'll tell you, the world has shaketh." So it is. I second wholeheartedly. This is an existential threat. But to your specific question, well, auction authority is a statutory right that Congress basically wrote in to allow the FCC to figure out how to deal with mutually exclusive licenses, in which basically it's the way in which we get spectrum to market very quickly. And what it did was ultimately replace what was a lottery system. So way back when we were trying to figure out how to deal with licenses, we did a very cumbersome lottery system, which had I guess some would argue there were benefits, but there were more negatives than there were positives. And so we thought an auction was probably the best way forward. We got a statute that said let's do that, and for 30 years up until March 9th, we had that auction authority. And so for the first time in 30 years, we don't have it, and we are now scrambling to figure out how do we do this, and that's a real problem. So to your question as to whether it's political, that has become more of a political argument when in all reality, it's economics. The question for an auction authority shouldn't be, whether more Republicans like it than Democrats or vice versa. It should be what gets spectrum out there fast. Is that an auction? Is that a rule change? Is that sharing? And again, anyone who's ever worked with the FCC, worked alongside the FCC, knows that there are two things that you have to get over before you can even talk about how spectrum gets out there. One is, hey, it's physics, not politics. Can we even do this? Secondly, what's it going to cost? Once you get over those two factors, then you can talk about auctions and everything else. But the problem right now is we can't even have that conversation because a tool is now taken out of the tool chest. Now the FCC has to figure out, okay, where in our, at times strange, at times conflicting, at times not so clear authorities can we use to grant licenses? I mean, T-Mobile is going through this right now. They went through an auction and they're now the FCC is scrambling to figure out, can we even grant the licenses? Hint, hint, they can. I wrote a whole piece about that, but again, that speaks to the issue of how inefficient it is to not have spectrum auction authority in play. So but I think it's important for all of our policy members to remember this. We as Americans also must realize that the race to 5G begins here. We are the ones who actually dictate a lot of the rules. And I think we often forget about that when we have conversations about China and what they're doing. And look, it is something that should be on every policymaker's mind. This is not just an American economic issue. This is very much a geopolitical issue, and the world is watching. So I really stress to all of our legislators to think this through and try to make this less about politics, more about the physics, and more about the economics.
Thanks. Paroma, I know that economists love the auctions. So can you explain the efficiency that it brings into a system when we use an auction?
Of course. So going off of what Joel said, the FCC actually began with what we call the beauty contest, where you would submit reams of papers. The whole FCC basement would be filled with them, and it'd take years to grant spectrum. And you had to only go by what people actually told you they were going to use it for and their need. There was no signal. Same thing for lotteries, right? It's slightly better, but then again, you're not sure that spectrum is going to the person or entity who's going to use it most efficiently. And that is something that auction does really well. It ensures that spectrum really goes to the entity that is going to use it most efficiently, and then we use price signals. I think for me, one of the biggest successes was the incentive auction. That was the first time that the FCC did both a reverse and forward auction, where on one side, broadcasters at an auction with a price of how much they should be paid, and they were willing to give up that spectrum. On the other side, the mobile companies at the other auction saying, this is what we are willing to pay for the spectrum. You bring the two sides together, and that gives you your incentive auction on one of the very important sort of low bands, the 600 megahertz. And subsequently, you've all heard about the huge C-band auction with $80 billion, the 3.45. So all these auctions have been extremely sort of successful. And talking about the 3.45, Shane, that's a shared spectrum. You just need rules on which side of the closet you cannot access. There's geographic exclusivity. There are certain things that the DoD is protecting. The rest you can use. There are various sharing mechanisms that can work even with exclusivity, as we saw in the 3.45 licensing.
Can you expand on that onto like a better sharing framework, which is part of the pipeline? I mean, I think part of this is the idea that we don't really have a thought out pipeline within the agencies as well as, so the commercial as well as the government use. Is there an ability to put a framework out there which gets to your earlier point of like, you can do this, you just need to put some thought into it?
So this sort of goes back to the principle of spectrum relocation. And as I said, it's all about you need to put sort of the costs and benefits. And when we talk about the costs, it's primarily the relocation cost for the incumbent. It was much easier when there was a lot of greenfield spectrum. Now it's becoming harder because now you have some defense systems, et cetera, in place, and one needs to be careful in evaluating the cost. For example, in C-band, right, one of the biggest things that the satellite operators were talking about is the cost of actually moving the satellite operations out of the band. And the FCC came up with a certain amount, which was about $10 billion, which was the cost of relocation and clearing and accelerated clearing. So it was really an innovation on the part of the FCC for the C-band to sort of tell, if you want the spectrum cleared earlier, you can just pay more to get it cleared. And I think that was one of the best uses of the market mechanism. So there are ways to do this. CBRS is a good sharing example. That was an innovation band. That was one of the first times the FCC actually went in and said, okay, if we sort of open up like a little bit of the megahertz of this band, let me see what can be done. There were a lot of utilities and smaller providers that took advantage of it. So there's a whole spectrum there, right? There's bad pun, but there's geographic sharing, as in the 3.45. There's a CBRS style sharing, which benefits a lot of the smaller entities. And I'm sure there's something in between. But one thing I think that we all need to remember is the two are complementary completely. They're not substitutes. It is not a case where you can have only sort of sharing or only exclusive. The two need to work in tandem, and the dividing line is sort of a benefit and cost analysis of what works.
Okay, so Peter, just to dive a little deeper on CBRS, for those of us who don't spend a lot of time in this, why do they call it the innovation band? Has that actually worked the way that the thought process came forward on that?
Yeah, so CBRS is a complex sharing mechanism that has incumbents, government, mostly Department of Defense users that have the highest priority. Then there are licensed users, and then there's what's called GAA, General Authorized Access, which is sort of semi-unlicensed. And it is called the innovation band because in theory it allows users to access that band that are not traditional cellular operators. But because it tries to be a solution for everyone, it ends up being a compromise for everyone as well. So it may serve a utility, it may have specific use cases, but it is not necessarily a very good solution for widespread coverage with 5G. So as an operator solution, it's a fairly poor solution because it operates at low power to avoid interference or minimize interference with government systems. It's an unpredictable resource because the Department of Defense at any moment can say, stop using these frequencies because there's some national emergency. But and also the license areas are fairly small compared to traditional licensing. But the low power is a real issue for operators. An operator that wants to deploy 5G continuously over a coverage area will need something like 7 times as many cell sites as they would with C-band. So that makes it a very unwieldy solution. The other thing to realize about CBRS is that it took a long time. There was something like an 8 to 10 year time frame from when the FCC issued its initial NPRM, Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, to licensed users of that spectrum. So that is typical for shared solutions. As Paroma mentioned, it can be very simple if it's geographic. Use it here, don't use it here. But a CBRS solution is meant to be dynamic, users in the same geographic area using the same spectrum effectively at the same time. So solutions like that can take a long time to develop. The other comment I should make about CBRS is that there are figures being published about the number of cell sites or base stations for CBRS, and they number in the hundreds of thousands. And I think those figures are a bit misleading because a vast majority of those are previous users of those frequencies at 3650 to 3700 under Part 90Z rules. These are users who are already using those frequencies who now were forced to redo their equipment and to follow the CBRS Part 96 rules. So you have to be a little careful about some of the statistics about the success of CBRS. The other thing about CBRS is that it does work, more or less, but it's also, from my point of view as a technologist, an obsolete technology. It was the best solution we could come up with for spectrum sharing a decade ago. And since then, our networks have become much more dynamic. They can control where the radio energy goes. One of the innovations in 5G is something called massive MIMO, and these are dense antenna arrays of something like 64 transmit, 64 receive antennas, and moving as we go through this decade towards 6G to hundreds of antenna elements. With that many antenna elements, you can direct the radio energy very precisely in the environment. So my view is that if there's going to be any future sharing, and there are now proposals of how sharing should be done in 6G. These are very preliminary, but they're all based on controlling dynamically where the radio energy goes. So my view is, for example, for 3.1 gigahertz, if we have to have some amount of sharing, it should be based on more advanced sharing methods and not using a very primitive approach really in CBRS, which is that if the DoD wants to use those frequencies, it just says, just shut down, don't use those frequencies. And it would make much more sense to say, don't direct your radio energy at the DoD system anymore, but use 3/4 of the cell capacity to continue operating. So you can do a sharing solution that's much more efficient. But again, I have to reiterate that whatever sharing solution we come up with, it's going to be band specific because incumbents are different in every band or users are different in every band, and it's going to take a long time to develop. So that's why your comments about exclusive license sharing, non-sharing approach is the most efficient if you want to deploy a high-capacity network quickly, be competitive with the rest of the world. It cannot be at this time, based on the technology we have, it cannot be based on a shared approach on a widespread basis.
Thanks for that. So, Clete, bringing it back in with the national security interest. So, you just brought up an interesting point that there is, the commercial market would like to be sharing, but I imagine DoD doesn't really want to share.
I mean, I think this is as over the past couple of years, as I've jumped into the security aspects of spectrum, I've been, I guess not surprised, but I've taken note of this is every holder of spectrum sees it as a zero-sum game. I mean, it's like, go back to your childhood in the closet. Like if I have this space, I don't want anybody else to use it. And I think this is, and it sounds like, I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish, but we have to flip the script on this and not look at spectrum as a zero-sum game, but look at how our country and our allies can maximize every hertz. And if spectral efficiency, as Peter was saying, physics is sort of reaching the limit of how efficient we can be, but we need to make sure that every incumbent user, whether it's federal or DoD or otherwise, is as efficient as they can be. And that we are maximizing, if it's geographic sharing, that we're using the latest technology to literally maximize every inch of where radio waves might go, so that we're not wasting, we're not wasting spectrum on. And I again, not a spectrum engineer, but I know we can do a lot more in that to eke out every, everything that a band can carry now than we could 10 years ago. So we need to make sure that every user does that. The big, and the reason is security. There's a, and this might have been true in the past, but there's a fallacy that there's security uses of spectrum and then there's commercial uses of spectrum. And that it's, as somebody put it the other day, it's trench warfare between DoD and the wireless industry. Mm-hmm. That's the wrong frame, and that's frankly a frame that's very dangerous for our security. I believe this down to my core from when I was a 22-year-old lieutenant in South Korea, and then a couple years later, a 25-year-old lieutenant in the former West Germany in 1998. Commercial strength is national security. And you can ask anybody on the Korean Peninsula which part of that peninsula is more secure. It's the one that's more commercially dynamic. West Germany reunified on West Germany's terms because East Germany didn't work. We won World War II because we had the most dynamic and large industrial base that created the arsenal of democracy. We won the Cold War because we had a dynamic economy, and the Soviet Union had an anemic, shriveled up economy. And that's even more the case in the 5G world, where everything, the cyber and physical world, is more and more connected. You can't have national security without commercial dynamism. And it's just so, yes, there are some, there will be aspects of security that are pure weapon systems or pure DoD or security systems, and there will be aspects of commercial dynamism that are, that are only consumer oriented. But there's an overlap of commercial strength and national security that is at the core of this discussion. And we have to make sure that everybody in our government that thinks about national security sees it that way. Because if they don't, and if they don't, we are going to have a China-based national champion like Huawei and TikTok dominating every sector of the global economy. And there's no rip and replace program, there's no technology ban, there's no weapon system that can secure our interests if Chinese national champions dominate the global economy, period.
You look like you have something to add to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, nothing gets me fired up like a conversation about the DoD and the wireless industry. But I think what you're hearing is that there is a 1,000-pound gorilla in the room, and that it's that the government is sitting on, even in the mid-band context, they're sitting on what, 3,300 megahertz of spectrum that would be more. I mean, my argument would be that it would be better used in a commercial capacity. I'm sure DoD and others would disagree, but I think that ultimately what this inherent conflict that we seem to have, well, first, I don't think it's inherent. I think they want to, as Clete says, would like to make it an inherent conflict between the wireless industry and government use. That just simply isn't the case. In fact, in a lot of ways, we're rowing in the same direction. And NTIA, I think, has been taken kind of a back seat on a lot of these conversations. I mean, you look at what happened in C-band. And in C-band, we had, it was signed, sealed, and delivered. We were ready to go. Wireless carriers were ready to deploy. And at the 11th hour, you have the FAA coming in and saying, oh, wait a minute, wait 1 second. we want you to reconfigure this because we fudged the numbers a bit on our own stuff. And so we want to resolve that before you do anything else. And if not, we'll say that 5G forces planes to fall out of the ground. I'll go to the ground. I'm like, okay, well, that's not really a starting point of a conversation. That's sort of a commitment, commitment that you're forcing wireless carriers into to do what you say. And I think what you'll find is that wireless carriers were more than amenable in trying to figure out a way forward to make sure they could use their licenses while at the same time not impact the FAA's use. You look at 24 gigahertz as well, which is another 5G spectrum band. And again, 3 days before the auction were to take place, I think the bids had already started. NOAA comes in and says, well, we're not going to be able to tell the weather because, or storm systems because somehow the use of your 5G phone in New York is going to really hurt our chances of figuring something out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Okay, don't know how that works, but fine. But again, I think what you're actually seeing is a natural apprehension from the government to release certain things that they find valuable. And you're seeing that over and over and over again. They've created a playbook to basically say, yes, we'll agree on the front end, and then when things actually start going in a certain direction, we'll go to the press, and we'll go to Congress, and we'll try to gum up the works in every way, shape, or form. And I think that is where we are really having the national security issue, and that is why you have to be able to say to the DoD, or Congress has to be able to say to the DoD and everyone else that, look, we're same team. Right? We are all trying to do that. We are all trying to work together. And remember, this is, and this requires at least some reiteration. The world is watching. Like when we go to WRC,
What's WRC?
Oh, the World Radio Conference. It's the annual conference where it's held by the ITU, which is the International Telecommunications. Is it Union?
Yes.
Yeah. That essentially outlines all of how 5G ought to operate and what systems are working, what systems aren't working. And usually it's kind of a slam dunk for us. I mean, thanks to the great work that we saw with the FCC with the GPI, I mean, creating a 5G fast plan, having that strategy, being able to say and articulate the specific bands that you want, what you want out of your 5G program, opening up an enormous swath of spectrum within 5 years, for the past 3 or 4 years, we've been able to just spike the football at WRC. We can't do that this year. This year, I mean, what do we have to really offer them? Hey, we might have opened up 6 gigahertz. We're still figuring that out too. 12 gigahertz is now kind of whatever. 13, we're not really sure of because we have to deal with 12. We don't have an auction authority anymore. While China, on the other hand, is saying, well, look what we did. We're opening up more licensed spectrum. So again, I think that this conflict that is self-created and self-inflicting is going to bite us in the rear end faster than we think it is, faster than I think most people think. And unfortunately, the politics are playing more of a role here instead of who need to be in the rooms, like the engineers and the economics and the economists. And I think, look, I applaud NTIA, which is the National Telecommunications Information Administration, sit in the DOC. Hopefully that's a good level set for everyone.
Yes.
Who actually help manage government spectrum. I applaud their efforts to try to figure out a way forward. But to assume that this is a tabula rasa, like no one's been thinking about that in NTIA, is kind of a ridiculous assertion. I mean, even like, I made sure I wrote this down because I wanted to get the gigahertz right. So look, we already have we've already done investigations on 3.1 through 3.45. That is already in the books. We already have reports that say this is good spectrum. We have other reports that are already in the, which is like the 4 gigahertz band. This to me is kind of a no-brainer. Right? Why aren't we just at least allowing the spectrum to be open or open up that spectrum so that way the folks at the FCC, like the economists and the physicists, can say, it can be done, and here's the best way forward. At this point, we're sitting while we sit on our hands. China is building, and I think that is something that should cause pause to everyone in this room and also every lawmaker.
So you've brought up the interagency process, which seems to be challenged from multiple tiers, from the Department of Defense, I think not really even coming into the room. And then you have That's might be my answer, is there just isn't an interagency process right now. So if the interagency process is not working and you don't have the agencies wanting to play with the commercial market as well as not collaborating with each other, is that a good time for the White House to step in?
You know, I would love to see more leadership from the White House. And I think that you actually saw that in some of these bands, like in 24 gigahertz, you saw that in C-band as well. The White House played a critical role in the State Department as well, stepping up and telling the FAA, telling NOAA, hey, they already went through this process. You have, like OSTP specifically, which is the Office of Science and Technology, right? So OSTP stepped in and said to NOAA, hey, back off. Like, you already had your opportunity to comment. You have to trust the process. Let it go. That is potentially a way forward for the Biden administration to look at some of this stuff and saying, hey, I mean, I think you saw a little bit of that with C-band. I wish I saw a little bit more leadership from the White House on pushing back on some of the good work that the FCC had already done. But again, I think, yes, the answer is, but it really should come from Congress. Congress needs to further solidify, when does the conversation stop? And I think that's the big problem. To Chairman Rosa Russell's credit, I think she was, during the C-band issue, she was trying to, push the needle in the right direction, but she doesn't really have the statutory authority to say, well, the clock stops here. We don't really have that delineation, really. So I think it really comes down to having Congress figure this out. And I think Congresswoman
Kathleen
Rogers is considering that in her bills, and she's and building incrementally finding ways to ensure that we do have this interagency process. But I think I'm preaching to the choir here. I mean, and to use another pun, we're all on the same wavelength. I think the big problem right now is that the question is outstanding. Who and what dictates commercial spectrum? Is it the NTIA? Is it the FCC? In my mind, the statute is very clear that once the FCC says something, after it's gone through the so-called interagency process, conversation's over. However, it hasn't worked out like that in practice.
So what about licensed versus unlicensed? And I'm just going to open this to the group. I mean, I know we've had different experiments with unlicensed. Peter, what's your thought on that?
Well, my view is that both unlicensed and licensed are critical for consumers and businesses, and that it should be done in a balanced fashion. There's great applications for unlicensed. Who doesn't use Wi-Fi? Everybody does. But try turning off your cellular and just relying on Wi-Fi and spend the day moving around the city. It cannot be done, right? You'll have pockets of connections here and there. So, but once you're home, it's a great solution, or inside a business or a place like this. So you really need both. And at this point, the United States is not in a balanced situation. We have 3 times as much spectrum allocated for unlicensed as licensed, if you look at all the bands. And that ratio is higher than any other country in the world. And it doesn't really make sense to me, because you really need both.
Other thoughts on licensed versus unlicensed?
No, I think there's not much to add. I agree with everything that Peter said.
And can we harp?
Clete, and then you can jump in.
Well, yeah, I'll add in again, not a spectrum engineer. The way I look at licensed versus unlicensed, as Peter said, both are critical. It's like your capillaries and your arteries are critical. The unlicensed is innovating at the local level, and that's where the United States is way ahead in of the world, and particularly China, in freeing up unlicensed. We're way behind in freeing up licensed, which are you might see as the primary arteries of the 5G ecosystem. So when your primary arteries are limited, that's not good. And I don't think it takes a spectrum engineer to understand that.
Great. So I'm going to open it up to questions. If you're online watching, you can send questions to jake.easter at aei.org, and I've got those in my hand, but I'm going to start because we've got people in the room and you were nice enough to show up. So who wants to go first? We have mic runners. Or we will have mic runners in just a minute. Well, we're close enough. Anybody who wants to go ahead? Courtney, just announce who you are and talk to the team here. You've got a mic right behind you.
I wanted to ask a question about 6 gigahertz specifically. So Joel, you mentioned we're about to go into the World Radio Conference this fall, and you said, Peter, that mid-band is defined, at least right now, between, I think you said 2 to 6 gigahertz. So, and then you mentioned that there are 3 times more, there's 3 times more unlicensed than licensed. So my question is, we've got, our country gave away all 1,200 megahertz of the 6 gigahertz to unlicensed. And what we're facing in the WRC is countries like China are thinking about giving it away entirely, or not giving it away, but having it be reserved for licensed. So the question is twofold. Number one, if a majority of the other countries in the world go with licensed for 6 gigahertz, what does that mean for our country? And if we decide everyone else is going in that direction and we need to course correct, can we course correct? Is it possible to course correct now that we've opened it up to unlicensed? Is it technically possible to say, divide the band and do 600 and 600, 600 for unlicensed, maybe 600 for licensed?
Peter, I think it starts with you.
Well, I'll just comment technically, which is that WRC plays a critical role globally in harmonizing spectrum to the extent that every country can use the same bands for the same purposes. You achieve the greatest economies of scale. It means chipsets for Wi-Fi or cellular can use the same frequencies, work the same way globally. So if you have one country, such as the United States, using 6 gigahertz for unlicensed and everybody else going with license, you basically break that efficiency of economies of scale. So from that point of view, I think that's a really bad thing. As far as changing the rules, I'll leave that for somebody else.
And Courtney, as you know, there's a lot of negotiations that happen, especially in the 6 gigahertz world. I think I totally agree. I think this is a power move on the side of China. China is basically saying the Americans don't have the goods. We do, and this is how we can use 6 gigahertz. But 6 gigahertz, I think, if you look back at what the commission was trying to do with the band, it took a more holistic approach, and the approach was ultimately to incorporate and include multiple stakeholders to be able to provide broadband services or 5G services or 5G-like services. I really don't like the idea of using China as a template for anything. So on one end, I totally look, personally, I would have liked 6 gigahertz to be licensed, but I can see why the FCC has gone the way it's gone. I think if the FCC wants to do something in terms of unlicensed stuff, maybe clarify the rules in 6 gigahertz first and figure out what I think that there's a lot of outstanding questions with all these unlicensed stuff, right? 3.5 doesn't even have, 5.9 doesn't even have real formalized rules. 3.5 is still trying to figure out uplinks and downlinks for PALs. So there's a lot of incremental stuff that I think that the FCC can do without, augmenting unlicensed footprint. Really unleashing the immense amount of unlicensed that we have out there. But the game is 3.1. That's the game. Especially for, if we really want to compete with China, we have to demonstrate that we can actually get hard mid-band spectrum out into the market. And frankly, it would be a missed opportunity if we didn't focus on 3.1 and make that the priority.
Any other thoughts on 6 by the panel?
Just to add to that, Courtney, we've done some work on Wi-Fi 6 and 6E, and the 6 gigahertz seem to be becoming more and more embedded, so it's going to be very costly to reverse course. And I think this is something that when spectrum is being allocated, this is something all the stakeholders probably need to be very careful about, as in going forward. You've already built a base of technology, and then changing rules becomes costly.
Other audience questions? You guys are just wowed by this over here. Good morning, Doug. Thank you for being here.
I'm Doug Brake with CTIA. So I was just curious if we could drill down a little bit more on WRC and the upcoming meeting in Dubai in November. My understanding is, as Peter says, like this is a real serious opportunity to harmonize spectrum brands internationally. I feel like there's not, there's like the last few years, right? There's such a focus on Huawei and different tools that the administration has to sort of curtail some of the growth of these national champions of China. And it seems like it's largely focused on chips and kind of the kind of strategic advantage that the U.S. has with chips. And I feel like lost in that conversation has been the harmonization of spectrum policy and how that feeds into chipsets and the equipment market internationally. So I'm just curious, I don't know if this is for Clete or anyone really, but
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on
Go
that.
for it.
yeah, double down.
So if you look at spectrum as this invisible natural resource, then you think about what the WRC is the purpose of these discussions to the extent possible bring harmonization to these various spectrum bands, so that you can have a shared use of this finite natural resource. To Joel's point about the China's power play, we have a situation where China is going to Dubai later this year with an estimated 80% more, supporting 80% more harmonization than the United States is. So the United States has been, we are the world's leader. We are our allies' leader. There's a quarter, to bring a football metaphor. Go Bulldogs, by the way. We're the quarterback of market democracies. You see that in alliances. You see it in economic discussions. If we're not helping call the plays, harmonization will go the other way. And the reason that matters and we could go into a long discussion about the linkage between spectrum harmonization and scale, global scale, and standards, technical standards, and supply chain, and which companies, and in this case, which Chinese national champions dominate a certain arena. So if we don't have China starts off with the scale of a 1 billion person captured market. And so their national champions have an enormous start at scale. We and our allies do things a different way. We think dynamism and innovation is the way to capture markets. But if China has realizes its goal of harmonizing 80% more spectrum than we have, then suddenly their 1 billion person market is a global market that's bigger than us, and we become a large island, but an island in spectrum. And that's what leads to these, we're dealing with Huawei with extremely strong and also very costly approaches. You can't do that you can't play whack-a-mole with rip and replace across every technology sector. And that's why global harmonization matters. Because if we don't lead, China will, and then we're going to be surrounded by these Chinese national champions.
But make no mistake, Huawei itself also doesn't have confidence in its own networks. I mean, you had the Huawei CEO say last year that they're having issues with handoffs between its 4G networks and its 5G networks. So this is to say that, although yes, China is a significant threat, but they have not won. And to make any assertion to the contrary, I think puts us into a whole different category of conversation. I think what we have to focus now, and as I will repeat again, the race to 5G starts here. We basically created it, and I think at the end,
and we're winning.
And,
we're leading now,
Clete,
right?
I had several way forwards, and I think we're on a good trajectory. But yes, keep in mind, China's a coming.
Can you ask the question, is a win They did tie, by the way. I mean, they had one tie that season.
Is that
But-
a win?
Yeah, that was a question. That's a long story. Budweiser had to figure that out if they were going to open
This isn't soccer.
The
So-
only way we can win is if we have a well-defined spectrum pipeline, and right
Precisely,
now,
yeah.
we don't.
Thank you, Peter, for getting us off the Cleveland Browns. But going back just quickly to what you were saying, just to put it in kind of commercial context. So by the 80% harmonization, that means the equipment manufacturers are going to build for the biggest audience that they can get, which will not be the American way of doing things, correct?
That's
Did I
right,
have that
that's
right?
right,
Okay.
that's right.
All right, we are at the top of the hour. So thank you, everybody, for your attention to this. This is going to be an ongoing topic, hottest thing going on this summer. Didn't know it till now, but now you're in on it. So thank you, and please thank my guests for being here today.